Welcome to one of this semester's Titus-Hepp lectures. We're really excited to have Professor Roy Cook from the University of Minnesota Twin Cities. Professor Cook is the CLA Scholar of the College and John M. Dolan Professor of Philosophy. Today I was teaching logic this morning and then philosophy through comics in the afternoon. One of the really neat things about having Professor Cook to campus is that I'm pretty sure I'm assigning some Cook in that logic course later this semester, and I've already assigned a heck of a lot of Cook in the philosophy through comics class. That's kind of a testament to the neat work that Professor Cook's doing across this sort of interestingly connected but arguably disparate disciplines. So Professor Cook has published Paradoxes, which is a great little book that surveys, I guess, a range of paradoxes, as well as, I guess, apart from Steve Yablo, you're the most influential commentator on the Yablo paradox. Thank you, Professor May. But outside of the field of philosophy of logic, and philosophy of mathematics, Professor Cook has edited The Art of Comics, which is a kind of landmark publication in the philosophy of comics, a sort of sustained and diverse inquiry into how comics work and what comics are, as well as the large and exceptionally useful Routledge companion to comics. I think it's not just,
It's just comics. We had to fight for that.
Yeah, it's great, including such chapters as horror comics and Canadian comics, but lamentably no Canadian horror comics. Maybe the second edition.
Yeah, we'll get that in.
In any case, Professor Cook is here presenting his talk, She-Hulk in the City, so please join me in welcoming Professor Cook.
Okay, so as you can see from the slide, I'm going to talk about the She-Hulk and the City. So the She-Hulk, before I do that, I should point out that this title slide is, unfortunately, I just forgot about this, way out of date. So the Northern Institute of Philosophy, I was a research fellow there, but it now no longer exists. And Pencil Panel Page was my long-running, for about 5 years, blog that I did with some other comic scholars that now no longer exists. These used to exist a year ago when I did that, or 2 years ago when I did that slide. So anyway, I'm going to talk about the She-Hulk and the city. You probably know what a city is. That's good. You don't live in one, but you know what one is. There's one down, about an hour down the road, there's a city. But you might not know about the She-Hulk. Those of you who are in Sam's class, I know you know who the She-Hulk is because you talked to me about the She-Hulk a good bit earlier today. We're going to see some other parts. But I'll tell you a little bit just to start about who the She-Hulk is. She's a Marvel Comics superheroine. She's the Incredible Hulk's cousin. She's a lawyer. At a certain point, she was working for the prosecutor's office, prosecuting a mobster. They put a hit on her. She got shot. She's bleeding out. And as luck would have it in superhero comics, the only person with the right blood type to give her a transfusion was her cousin, the Incredible Hulk. That's how she gets her Hulk-like powers. Her powers are a bit different than the Hulk's, but she still gets giant and green and super strong. She is, one thing that's interesting about the She-Hulk is she is in a certain sense Marvel Comics' flagship solo superheroine, or at least was until very recently. Marvel Comics has sort of, in the last 5 years, gone through this revolution in terms of suddenly figuring out how to write good female characters, right? And realizing that women want to read these comics, and this didn't used to be the case, right? But prior to that, the She-Hulk was the best-selling solo superheroine Marvel published, right? There are other more well-known female superheroes in Marvel Comics, but they're always part of teams, the X-Men or the Fantastic Four. So it already says something about the depiction of and use of women in superhero comics that probably prior to either this talk or maybe prior to Sam's course, for those of you who are students and might have talked about the She-Hulk earlier in the course, probably at least half this room had no idea at the beginning of the semester who the She-Hulk was, right? And many of you probably didn't have any idea until you walked in this room, right? So that says something a little sad about the role of women characters in superhero comics, but that is fortunately changing, and it has a lot in the last 5 years. But the real reason I'm interested in the She-Hulk is because the various runs of the She-Hulk involve a lot of metafiction. And one of the central themes of my research in the philosophy of comics and the aesthetics of comics is figuring out the mechanisms by which Stories are constructed, the mechanisms via which we interpret and understand stories using metafiction, right? The idea is metafiction is in some sense breaking the rules. And it's often when the rules get broken or bent, that's sometimes the best place to look to figure out what the rules are in the first place. Okay, so that's sort of the overarching thought. Now, I'm not going to do a whole lot of really hard, deep theoretical stuff today. What I'm actually going to say some of that stuff, but I'm just also going to show you some really cool examples of the sorts of things in comics that I pay a lot of attention to and think about, and I'm going to use the She-Hulk to do it. But I'm going to put this particular talk, I've written like 5 papers on the She-Hulk, so I've got lots of different stuff about the She-Hulk I can talk about. I've written more on the She-Hulk than I think the rest of the world combined, really. But this particular talk has a particular twist, right? Because there's a certain aspect of certain parts of the metafiction in the She-Hulk, and in other comics as well, that hinges on the role that the city plays in comics, and how the role that the city plays affords certain metafictional opportunities for authors who want to actually do the sorts of things I'm talking about. So this is going to focus on the role that the city plays in this sort of stuff. So we're going to be looking at certain kinds of metafiction, although I am going to give you a catalog of types of metafiction at a certain point in the paper. All right, I probably shouldn't talk that long for every one of the 37 slides. All right, so here's the first thing I just want to point out is that superhero comics generally, and well, comics in general, but especially superhero comics, are an essentially urban phenomenon, right? Now, not every comic is made in the city, right? Used to be all the comics were made in the city. If you wanted to make comics, you had to move to New York or one of the other major cities because you had to be able to deliver the art, right? Now, of course, we can fax it and scan it and send it. So superhero comic creators live all over the place, but the companies are still located, typically in New York, especially for Marvel and DC are both in New York. But also, if you read, especially superhero comics, you find that superhero comics occur in the city. Very rarely do you find rural environments as the central place of action in superhero comics. That's not to say they don't play any role, right? I mean, the most famous superhero of all time, Superman, grew up in Smallville on a farm. And there are Superboy comics that take place in Smallville. But those are primarily interesting because we were already interested in the Metropolis full-grown Superman city comics, right? And we've got Gotham and we've got New York with Spider-Man. So superheroes comics occur in the city, and that's also indicated by lots of comics, both superhero and otherwise, having city in the title. So there are just 10 that I found in about 20 minutes when I made this slide that have city in the title. Okay, so that's the first thing to think about. But between the big two superhero publishers, Marvel and DC, there's a big difference in terms of the role that cities play. So DC Comics has these fictional superheroes, right? We don't actually believe in Superman. There are superheroes running around protecting cities now, guys that dress up in body armor and stop crimes. But we're talking about Superman and Batman, right? These are fictional characters, but in DC Comics, they also live in fictional cities, right? Superman lives in Metropolis. Now, we know Metropolis is kind of an analog of New York, right? Batman lives in Gotham. Gotham is an analog of either Chicago or Detroit, depending on the artist and writer. But they're fictional cities, right? There isn't really a city called Metropolis. Well, there probably is, but there isn't a big East Coast city called Metropolis or a big, sort of Great Lakes city called Gotham, right? These are fictional cities. Marvel Comics, on the other hand, which is what, by the way, the She-Hulk is in the Marvel Comics universe, and this is going to be relevant. These are, of course, fictional characters. This is Spider-Man's web, and it's looking over Manhattan, right? But the stories take place in real cities. In fact, the vast majority of Marvel Comics take place in New York City. Okay? In fact, in Manhattan, the vast majority of them. More are now taking place in Brooklyn. I think they're trying to make themselves seem hip. And there's some very cool comics that take place in Brooklyn, but a lot of it takes place in Manhattan. Fantastic Four, Spider-Man, Captain America. Okay, so these take place in real cities. Now, not all Marvel cities are real. Right? Marvel Comics also has a lot of made-up places. One is in the news a whole lot right now because of a current film that's doing relatively well in the theaters, The Black Panther. Wakanda, right, is a made-up country. Right? So not every comic in the Marvel universe takes place in a real city or a real location. Doctor Doom rules a fictional country called Latveria. Right? This is a made-up country. And as a result, there is in fact a publication called the Marvel Atlas, which gives you two kinds of maps. It gives you things like maps of Manhattan that show you where the Fantastic Four's headquarters is, and where the Avengers headquarters is, and where Peter Parker, Spider-Man's apartment is. But then you also get these those are sort of partially fictional, because they still also have real landmarks from Manhattan on the same map. But then you get a map of, say, Latveria, which is completely fictional. There's no such country, right? Nothing in that map is real. Okay. And this isn't what I want to focus on, but it's worth mentioning just in passing. I think this is pretty interesting. The difference between setting your comics in fictional cities and setting your comics in real cities, a lot of the times it doesn't seem to matter too much. But one time when it really did matter was post 9/11. Because all of the comic book companies, just like many media outlets and lots of other sorts of organizations, wanted to do various kinds of tributes to the people that died, to the first responders, things like this, displays of patriotism, the sort of things we are familiar with that happened after 9/11. But if you look at, and Marvel and DC both did comics where the profits went to various charities for first responders or the families of victims, things like that. But the actual comics that they created for these were very, very different. Well, why? Well, Marvel Comics, 9/11, I mean, the primary attack happened in Manhattan, right? So that gave Marvel Comics both an advantage and a disadvantage in sort of telling stories or doing comics that were reacting to 9/11. On the one hand, there was this huge plot problem, right? Within the world of superheroes, why didn't Spider-Man stop the attack, right? Because they have to have the attack happen so the superheroes and these other characters can react to it. But why didn't Spider-Man or the Avengers or Fantastic Four, right? If they could fight off Galactus, why couldn't they stop Al-Qaeda, right? So that was a problem that they had to navigate very carefully. But they also could have their characters who fictionally lived in New York personally respond to the tragedy that happened on their home turf, at least fictionally, right? So you got even though there were some worries about how to do the plot, how to handle this issue of why weren't the superheroes there to help, at least in the fictional story, the superheroes had a sort of personal connection to it that made it for a particular kind of story they told. DC Comics, on the other hand, had to be much more abstract about it, because their comics don't take place in New York City. New York City is not a main locale in the DC universe. It pops up occasionally, but not very often, because we know Metropolis is this sort of doppelganger for New York, but it's not New York, right? So you get much more sort of symbolic celebrations of the first responders or a patriotism, but you don't get these drawn-out plots about the superheroes responding to it, because the superheroes weren't there, because they're not in New York, they're in Metropolis or Gotham, right? So that's one place where the aspect of the city makes a difference. But here's another thing, and this is what I want to focus on. So Marvel Comics take place in New York City. And in fact, that's the Marvel Comics Guide to New York City, where you could roam around New York City, seeing the buildings which stand in the spots where landmarks in the fictional Marvel universe should be. Right? So you can go and see this building that is, you can go find the intersection where the Baxter Building ought to be and where the Fantastic Four ought to be if you were in the fictional world. It's very strange. And that's actually not the current headquarters, but that was the headquarters a number of years ago of Marvel Comics. So Marvel Comics take place in this certain city, New York City, but they also are made in New York City. Right? Why is this interesting? Well, because this opens up some really interesting metafictional possibilities about having the real-life location of the Marvel Comics company interact in certain ways with the fictional location of the fictional characters that they're writing stories about. Now, why did I put the gratuitous cheesecake on this slide? I did that more for me than for you. Actually, if I stop there, you could really misinterpret that. It's a reminder to myself, but also for you. I'm going to be talking about a particular collection of comics of the She-Hulk from the late 80s and early 90s, written and drawn by John Byrne. This is not what I want to focus on today, but I do feel the necessity to point out that with regard, and we talked about some of this in the classes earlier today, with regard to the representation of gender, or the representation of women in comics, which is a big, big problem in superhero comics, getting better, fortunately, in the last 5 years again, but still a problem. There are a lot of issues going on here. John Byrne was known as what's called a good girl artist, part of the appeal of John Byrne, he was a really good storyteller and a really good comic artist, but he also drew really, really sexy women and was known for that. And hence was known for sort of pin-uppery, for lack of a better word. And there's going to be some of that in the slides that I show you alongside the really interesting metafiction that I want to talk to you about. So I just want to flag that there are these issues here. Those are not the issues I want to talk about today, but that's not because I don't think they're worth talking about. I just want to talk about other stuff today. And in fact, I've written an essay on some of the most egregious, but also kind of most interesting aspects of this in John Byrne's She-Hulk work, but that's a different paper and a different talk. So I just wanted to flag that there are issues here. I'm aware of them. I worry about them. But there are other things I want to talk about today. Okay. So before we start talking about these two aspects of the city in Marvel Comics and how this affords some really interesting metafictional possibilities, and in particular, how it's going to show that you've been reading Marvel Comics wrong your entire life, at least according to John Byrne's take on things, we should say a little about what metafiction is. So metafiction, this is a definition of metafiction from a really influential book by Patricia Waugh. So I'll just read it out. Metafiction is a term given to fictional writing which self-consciously and systematically draws attention to its status as an artifact in order to pose questions about the relationship between fiction and reality. In providing a critique of their own methods of construction, such writings examine the fundamental structures of narrative fiction. Quite a mouthful. A couple things to flag about this. First of all, she talks about writing. Okay, but not all fiction has to be writing. Right? The pictures in comics are not writing. Also, films are not writing. You could have metafictional films, right? So we want to broaden the definition a little bit. There's also a worry about calling it metafiction, because you could have non-fictional writing that was meta in a similar way, right? So we want to have like meta texts or meta literature or meta writing or something, but metafiction seems to be the general tag that's stuck, so we'll just continue to use it. Here's a definition that's a little looser, but I think actually a little more accessible as well and helpful, less dry and academic-y. And it's, what is a metacomic, right? Because we're interested in metafiction in comics. So a metacomic is a comic that is about comics in one sense or another, where this meta aspect of the narrative is intended not only to further the narrative, right? You're telling a story, but to comment on the nature of narrative itself, right? So the idea is you're riding along in the story, immersed in the story, this narrative. Somebody's telling you a story, you're reading it or viewing it or whatever. And there comes a part in the narrative where it's not just telling you the story, but it's also somehow commenting on either the telling of that story or storytelling more generally, right? It's sort of playing two roles. And another way to this may be a symptom rather than a definition, but another thing that tends to happen with metafiction is it sort of pushes you outside the fiction. Right, you're immersed in the story, you're excited about what's happening with the characters, and then suddenly you find the story somehow forces you to outside of it to sort of think about how the story is being constructed rather than just immersed in the story itself. Okay. I apologize for those of you who are in Sam's class because some of this is a little repetitive, but it's important, so we'll go through it again. Okay, so that's what I'm interested in. And I want to run through quickly a taxonomy of different types of metafiction. Okay? Just so we get a feel for the sort of things I'm interested in. This list is not meant to be exclusive or exhaustive. There's going to be metafiction out there that is not going to fit into any of these 6 categories. Also, there's plenty of metafiction, including some of the examples I have on the slide, that could fall into more than one category, that are either a mix or borderline between the two. But it still just gives us a couple roots for understanding different ways that metafiction can happen. So the first category is narrative metacomics. So a narrative metacomic is, and by the way, this taxonomy is something I came up with, but I sort of picked and chose from other people who've done similar things. So if this were a paper, there'd be a big footnote with a list of all those other papers, but that messes up slides and makes the slides not so pretty. So a narrative metacomic is a comic whose plot involves the production, consumption, or collection of comics, or any other aspect of comic subculture and its trappings, right? So basically, any story that's somehow about comics itself is going to be a narrative metacomic. All right, sometimes this can be trivial, right? So an autobiographical comic is trivially a narrative metacomic, at least if the person creating the autobiographical comic tells something about their life as a comics creator, right? Because they're writing about comics, right? So you're reading the comics and you're in the story, but you're also sometimes being pushed out to think about what's happening to this creator in the story, how that connects to the actual story itself and the way he's telling it to you in this document, right? But they're more interesting cases. So one interesting case here is a passage from John Byrne's run on the She-Hulk. She's just finished battling Stiltman. She's in this outfit, and Wheezy, her sort of sidekick, asks, I'm not going to read all this dialogue, but she basically asks, how is it that your clothing doesn't rip inappropriately, right, or rip off when you're fighting these metal-clad armor and blah, 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 right? I know you're indestructible, but what keeps your clothing from getting all busted up? And she says, oh, well, look at the label, and it's got the Comics Code Authority sewn into the clothing. And the Comics Code Authority was the organization that basically censored comics from the 1950s until about a decade ago, right? Most comic companies, with a few exceptions like Dell and Disney that had such kid-friendly reputations they didn't need to do it, all of their comics went through the Comics Code Authority, often got sent back for revisions because it was too violent or too sexy or this or that, or had the word werewolf in the cover. At one point that was ruled out. But as a result, that's the idea, right? The Comics Code seal would appear on the cover of a comic that was approved by the Comics Code. It was a sign that it was clean and wholesome and healthy, right? But now we get it in the story, right? But notice the Comics Code, it's part of our world, about the comics creation world, not part of their world, right? But she makes it a part of her world, and it's the fact that it's sewn into her clothing that keeps her clothing from getting damaged in, risque ways while she's having battles. All right, Cameo MetaComics. So this is the second category. Cameo MetaComic is a comic whose plot involves interaction with characters, locales, or other elements that are not in the same continuity. By continuity, I mean like the maximal fictional universe. So there's Marvel continuity. And that's the main Marvel story, all the different superheroes and how they interact. And then DC continuity. And then we've got Star Wars continuity and the Buffyverse continuity and on and on. Or whose plot involves parodying or spoofing other comics. Okay, so here we have an example from actually a comic. I'm going to talk about it more length later in the talk. Of a page of the She-Hulk done in the style of E.C. Cigar's Popeye, right? The best part of this is actually Galactopus, which is Wimpy from Popeye, Galactus is this giant planet-devouring cosmic being in Marvel Comics, but here he's got the moon between two pieces of bread, because of course Wimpy always liked to eat his burgers, right? So that's pretty clever. There's a lot of clever stuff in those pages. Unfortunately, we don't have time to do sort of close readings of any of them, but it is pretty awesome. Okay, an intertextual metacomic is a metacomic, is a comic whose content interacts or refers to, probably should put that, in some manner with the content of some other text or artwork. Right? So this is just intertextuality, right? It's referencing other works, and you're meant to interpret what's going on in that work via connecting it to some other work, right? This is a pretty common kind of metafiction, actually. You run across this sort of thing, in various kinds of artwork and narratives, references to other works. But you notice you have to pull yourself out of the story and think about the other work to make the connection, right? So it is metafiction, although it's sometimes quite thin. I put this image on there just because this image fascinates me. This is actually not a comic book page. It's very similar to a cover from a She-Hulk book, but it's actually by I think he's Norwegian, an artist called Arrow, who basically made a living doing these mashup rip-offs of comic book covers, not particularly well drawn, given that he's literally just copying stuff from the covers of comic books. And he finally got sued by Marvel Comics and some of the artists that he had ripped off, and I think he's out of business now. It's a very strange, and the coloring is different, and so that's actually something that's referencing the She-Hulk comics, and it's a painting. Or actually, that's a print, but I think it's originally it's a print of a painting. All right. All right, now we get into some of the more sort of overt, obvious kinds of metafiction that are more interesting. So we have Selfaware MetaComics. So Selfaware MetaComic is a comic whose protagonist, or maybe some other character, it doesn't have to be the main character, is aware that he or she is a character in a comic. Okay, so this is a page, and I'm actually going to read this because it's amazing. So this, She-Hulk in the comic has been knocked out. She's been unconscious for about 8 pages, and other stuff has been going on. So she goes, hey, wow, pretty exciting stuff, huh, kids? I mean, Spider-Man, Mysterio, the Headman, headless bodies walking around, but not too funny, is it? This isn't the page I was thinking about. Anyway, but she's talking to the audience. This is a different page from the one I had in mind. I'm not going to read it all because it's not the interesting one. Sorry. But yeah, she's describing what's going on and asking the reader if they're enjoying it and just having this conversation with the reader, right? She's aware she's a character in a comic and she's interacting with us. As we're going to see, what's much more interesting is I'll get to that, when you combine this with Authorial MetaComics, which is going to be our sixth category. We also have formal metacomics, and this is the category I actually probably get most excited about. So formal metacomics are comics whose plot involves formally manipulating the conventions of the comic medium. Right? Things like panel borders and motion lines, and just the various rules we have in place for how to make a comic and how to read a comic. Okay, so in this comic, the She-Hulk's trapped in a parallel dimension. And she does this in multiple issues. She figures out that she can travel between dimensions by ripping a hole in the page and stepping through. Right? Obviously she's not supposed to, if she were a normal character, she's not supposed to know that she lives on a page that she can rip, right? But she can. And the dialogue here is great. She-Hulk, what now? Where is this place? Don't ask questions. We're heavily into the zen of comic books here. It only works if you don't think about it. Now follow me, all of you, right? So she's ripped a hole in the page, and this is a 2-page spread. And it actually, as they get to the second half of it, which I just couldn't fit on the slide, she warns the people behind her not to trip over the staple. Because he actually planned it so it was the center spread, so the staple would be there. And this is actually, you can spend an hour reading these 2 pages. So back in the day, comic books would have these mail order pages where it would list back issues you could order and how much, right? And they'd be these just tiny print and tons of, it's basically a title and then just has these numbers, issue numbers, price, issue number, price. But there's all sorts of like little comments about other people's comics in here. So Fantastic Four, 231 to 294, all Byrne issues, only ones worth reading. Oh sure, maybe number 5 was okay, but that Lee Kirby stuff is so overrated, you know? I mean, come on, what did they ever do that was worth remembering? I mean, Dr. Doom is okay, but like, he's no Spinneret, is he? And Spinneret's like this stupid character that Byrne came up with. So he's making fun of himself and other people on these pages as well. But finally, we get to Authorial MetaComics. And an Authorial MetaComic is a comic whose plot involves the appearance of the writer, artist, or other creator as a character in the comic. So this is issue 31. See, I told you it was on a slide, so those of you who were in the class when I couldn't remember what issue number this was, now you know. So John Byrne did the She-Hulk for the first 8 issues. Then there were some disagreements, and he left, and he came back at issue 31. And notice in this cover art, that's John Byrne over the She-Hulk's shoulder, trying to nail a number 9 over the number 31, and just pretend like it's those issues that he wasn't writing never happened. He says, Renee, hey, no fair, Renee, you said I could do anything on my first issue. Put your ego back in its box, John. I'm already letting you get away with more than I probably should on the inside. What's really interesting, the first page of this issue, the She-Hulk wakes up and says, oh, what a weird dream. And nothing that happened by the previous writers is ever referenced in the next 20 issues he does. And he stays on until issue 50, which I'm going to talk about in a minute, but it's pretty great. I mean, yeah, I'm sure the other artists and writers were annoyed as heck, but it's kind of bold and amazing. Okay, by the way, I should point out, this is Renee Witterstatter, who was actually the editor of the comic at the time. She also makes regular appearances inside the comic, alongside John Byrne, and we're going to see some of those. Okay. All right, so that is our taxonomy of different types of metafiction. Like I said, it's meant to be a sampling, right? A majority of cases of metafiction that I've run across fall into one or more of these categories, but it wouldn't surprise me if somebody finds something weird that doesn't, right? It's not meant to be exhaustive. But now I want to talk about a particular kind of metafiction that occurs in the She-Hulk and elsewhere, and arguably is actually the right way to understand all of Marvel Comics, thanks to John Byrne. That connects to this idea about the city and connects to this dual role that New York City plays for Marvel Comics as both the place where the comics are made, actually, and the place where the adventures in the comics occur fictionally. Okay. So, where do we start? Well, I'm going to actually start with an issue of the Fantastic Four. From Fantastic Four number 262 from 1984. Classic Fantastic Four issue, often held up as one of the greatest Fantastic Four stories of all time. Often, oddly enough, by the same people who want to say that all the weird metafictional stuff in the She-Hulk isn't really canon, shouldn't count, it's imaginary because it's too weird. And they forget how weird the beginning and end of the story is. Okay? Here's the first few pages. Basically, that's Byrne talking to not Renee Witterstatter, his male editor when he was working on the Fantastic Four. The editor's complaining because he's behind schedule. Byrne says, I'm trying. What does he say? I appreciate your position. Believe me, I just don't have the story for this issue. I've been calling and calling all week, but all I get from the Baxter Building is the Fantastic Four's robot receptionist making polite apologies. Tell him I'm sorry, but I'm not about to risk making up a story. You know how the Fantastic Four hate it when we do that, especially the Thing. And he says, all right, give me another 24 hours, okay, I'll try the Fantastic Four headquarters again, and if I don't get satisfaction, I'll invent a story. Right? So he's already setting it up so that John Byrne, the creator of the Marvel Comics, lives in this fictional world. He's inserted himself in as Authorial Metafiction. But notice it's also suggesting that in the world that these comics happen, Marvel Comics is a company, John Byrne works for them, and they create nonfiction. Right? They document in comic book form. I mean, you notice, he's got the panels laid out. He's still making comics, right? But they document the real-life adventures of the Fantastic Four in comic book form. Okay. Then in this page, John Byrne's stressing out. He calls the robot receptionist again. Don't know where they are. I'll tell them you called. Well, at this rate, I'll have to make up some dumb, John Byrne, I have come for you, the Watcher, right? The Watcher is this, in retrospect, very creepy character who lives on the moon and watches us. And he's part of a race of Watchers, and they refuse to interfere. But of course, our Watcher is actually kind of a nice guy, Uatu, and he interferes all the time and breaks his oath to help out. But he's not supposed to interfere. He's just supposed to watch and chronicle as we do things, right? He's kind of like the ultimate cosmic voyeur. But Uatu, and he was murdered at some point recently, I think. I haven't read that comic, but I've heard about it. So basically, now I've skipped all these pages. So, fear not, Earthman. No harm can befall you here. We are beyond the physical plane. You are now being shown sights that few human eyes have ever beheld. I appreciate that, sir, but why me? Because you are the chronicler, John Byrne. Because to you has fallen the task of recording the exploits of the Fantastic Four. And even as we speak, events unfold which may herald the last adventure of that heroic foursome. So you must report upon, and then the next page has the trial of Galactus. Basically, Galactus, I already mentioned, cosmic, giant, planet-eating, cosmic thing. At one point, he's dying, and Reed Richards, because he feels he believes in the sanctity of all living things, saves Galactus. Galactus gets healthy, and he goes and eats a planet that a bunch of people live on. Various alien races are a little pissed. They're like, you could have just let the dude die. And all these millions of people that lived on that planet, and the ones Galactus is going to eat in the future would have lived. Isn't that a good trade? Sort of very consequentialist. And it turns out they have the trial, and it turns out Reed Richards is vindicated because it turns out, just lucky plot twist, that the sort of stability of the multiverse depends on the existence of Galactus. He plays some central, unspecified but central and essential roles, so he has to live. Right? So Reed Richards is saved, and then we get back, and John Byrne, Uatu brings John Byrne back, and he writes up the story for Marvel Comics, the journalism company, right? Okay. So, before I get to the next slide, so the idea here is that John Byrne, the fictional character John Byrne, creates comics, non-fictional comics, at least in the story, that detail the exploits of the Fantastic Four. He lives in the same world. He creates these comics, okay? But they're non-fiction. They're telling the real story of what happened. Right? This is an idea that comes up again in later She-Hulk comics written by other people. A number of creators have played with it, but it mostly started with John Byrne. There's a few things in early Fantastic Four issues that are similar, but it isn't quite this. But this also suggests, right, very strongly that the fictional comic book that inside the story is nonfiction that John Byrne creates. You're meant to understand that to be exactly like the actual comic you're reading. Okay, that comic is fictionally, right? It's not just telling you a story. It's sort of you're meant to pretend that comic is journalism, that you're reading John Byrne's journalistic account of the exploits of the Fantastic Four. Okay. All right, but that has some twists. So now I want to back up a little bit and think about how fictional truth works in general. Okay, so the question of fictional truth is just how, as philosophers, do we explain what makes certain claims true in a fiction, all right? It never says this in the stories, but it turns out Sherlock Holmes is human. Anybody who thinks he's not human is misunderstanding the stories. But it never outright says in any of the stories, Sherlock Holmes is not a robot, right? But he's not, right? You're misunderstanding the story. There are all sorts of complex mechanisms that are involved in how we figure out what's true and false in a fiction. Okay. All right. And the most, oddly enough, Kendall Walton himself has abandoned this view, but nevertheless, the most influential account of, at least if we were sort of counting believers, in analytic philosophy of the most influential account of fictional truth is due to Kendall Walton. There are lots of variations where people have tinkered with the details. And in a nutshell, fitting on one slide, this is Kendall Walton's account of fiction. So fictions are props in games of make-believe, right? So he compares a fiction to kids out in the woods playing bear, where the rules are that anytime there's a stump, right, you pretend that's a bear and you run away from it screaming. And he says, so the stump is a prop in a game of make-believe. It's kind of, the rules of the game plus the stump cause you to imagine certain things to be the case. He says, basically what he says is, other than the level of complexity, fictions like novels and comic books are no different. They're basically very complicated sets of rules for what you're meant to imagine. All right. Now, if they were written like ruled books, they wouldn't be very interesting, right? Obviously, they're sort of coded up in a very nice packaging, right? But at heart, logically, they're just rules telling you what you are and aren't meant to imagine in a game of make-believe, right? So as you're experiencing the fiction, reading the novel, watching the film, reading the comic, you're basically, if you're doing it right, you're imagining the things that this thing prompts you to imagine in various ways. Okay, seems pretty sensible. So fictions prescribe that we imagine certain things to be true. A proposition, or sentence if you don't like the fancy word, is true in a fiction if and only if the fiction prescribes that we imagine that the proposition is true. But one thing that's important is different kinds of fiction prescribe imaginings in different ways. Right? Different genres prescribe you to imagine things in different ways. Right? If you're reading a novel and a giant, scaly, winged beast suddenly appears in front of the characters, and you're wondering whether that beast breathes fire, whether you're reading a John Crichton, is that his name? Michael Crichton novel, or you're reading a Tolkien novel, right, is going to make a difference. Right? Tolkien novel, likely it breathes fire. Michael Crichton novel, less likely it breathes fire, all right? So genre makes a difference, but also the form of, the art form, the kind of artwork it is, the kind of fiction it is, makes a difference in terms of how the work generates these rules about what you are and aren't meant to imagine. Okay, so let's think, I'm gonna go through a couple stages until we get to the complicated way we're meant to, at least according to Byrne, that we're meant to imagine things when we're reading a Marvel comic book, right? And of course, this only applies to Marvel. That's part of the whole point, right? They're able to do that because Marvel Comics is actually situated in New York, so they make it fictionally the case that it's also there, right? They draw that link and insert Marvel Comics into the comic, but as in the story, Marvel Comics is this journalism company. So let's say you're reading a novel about the Vision. By the way, if you don't know who the Vision is, there'll be a picture of him on the next slide. You've seen the movies, so you probably know who the Vision is, even if you don't read the comics, because the movies are awesome too. So let's say you read this sentence in a novel about the Avengers. In the first official statement since the disappearance, the Vision attempted to calm growing fears that the abduction is in fact a prelude to an alien invasion. All right, what does that do? Well, this probably isn't the full story, but it prescribes us to imagine that the Vision attempted to calm growing fears that an abduction is in fact a prelude to alien invasion. That's what it tells us to imagine. It's pretty straightforward, right? I mean, it's kind of trivial. Okay, so far, so good. But of course, comics are not literature. They're not, despite what English professors tell you. They have lots in common with literature, but they're not literature. I don't think. I think they're a different art. People always get upset like I'm insulting comics. No, they're just a different art form, right? They're as good as literature, they're just not literature. Movies aren't literature either. All right. But let's say, by the way, I changed the text so I'd have this nice example to go through. That's not the original words in the balloons. So what if you saw this panel instead? I'm so worried. Do you think it's an invasion? No, I don't think the abduction could be a prelude to an invasion. Really? Watch the road, honey. I just put that in because that balloon was already there. All right. This prescribes something a little different because it's a comics panel, right? It's an image. What does it prescribe? It prescribes us to imagine that the Vision attempted to calm growing fears that the abduction is in fact a prelude to an alien invasion, and further that he's attempting to calm his wife, the Scarlet Witch, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, and that they're in a car, and blah, blah, blah. But this is the kicker, because it's an image, and we're meant to imagine that his doing so appears to us as it appears in the image. When he's trying to calm her fears, it looks like that, or at least somewhat like that. Okay, so this is additional content. But what about this? Right? Well, this could be a sort of fun promotional material. By the way, this example is from the original Marvel Superhero Secret Wars from the 80s, if you know your comic book history or care. So this is meant to be a fictional newspaper. But let's imagine you go to the comic store and this is like a promotional item and you pick it up, right? Well, what are you meant to imagine when you look at that top? Vision speaks out, new leader for the Avengers, and if you look close, it says he attempted to calm growing fears that the abduction is in fact a prelude to an alien invasion. Well, here, if you have something like this in your hands, you're meant to imagine that the fiction being read is in fact a genuine newspaper report of the fact that the Vision attempted to calm growing fears that the abduction is in fact a prelude to invasion. Right? If they make this sort of promotional fake news, pretend newspaper, when you're reading it, you're supposed to pretend it's a real newspaper about the superheroes. Right? Okay. But of course, John Byrne's idea is not that Marvel Comics produces newspapers. Right? John Byrne's idea is that Marvel Comics, things like this, issue number 50, right, that this is comic book journalism, fictional comic book journalism. So we're meant to imagine that the fiction being read is in fact a genuine journalistic comic, right, journalism in comics form, report of the fact that the Vision calmed growing fears, blah, 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 blah. Right, that we read the comic and we're meant to pretend that this is comic book journalism, right? We're meant to pretend that this is the comic book that in the fiction, the fictional John Byrne wrote describing the fictional Fantastic Four's exploits, or the Avengers and the Vision in this case. Okay, so we're meant to read these things as if they were fictional journalism. And by the way, it's worth noting that real comic book journalism is not an unknown thing. Right? For example, Joe Sacco has made a career of doing actual journalism in comic book form. Right? These are two of his works, Palestine and Footnotes on Gaza. He does a lot of work on the Middle East. And he basically goes and he takes notes and he interviews people and he goes and does the work a journalist does, but when he comes home, instead of typing it, he draws a comic. All right? So so that's actual comics journalism. We're just meant to imagine that Marvel Comics are fictional journalism. We're meant to pretend they're journalism. Right? Notice in there are novels that are written like journalistic reports. Right? I think there's a zombie novel of some sort that does this. Right? Yeah, that one, World War Z. Where it's fiction, it's these fictional news reports, right? Or, the very classic example is the Orson Welles' War of the Worlds radio broadcast, which of course people mistook for real, supposedly, but it was fictional journalism. It was written as journalism, and that's why it might have fooled people, but it was fictional, right? We're supposed to read these comics in the same way, says John Byrne. Okay, so that's already pretty cool. But John Byrne, after he's already done this, and notice since the She-Hulk is part of the larger Marvel universe, right, and this also started this whole line in the Fantastic Four, presumably this holds for all Marvel comics, right? We should, at least according to John Byrne's take on them, we should read them as fictional journalism, right? We should read them as we should pretend that these are comics that John Byrne created about the real-life exploits of the Fantastic Four. Okay. Now, this gets even cooler because remember I talked a lot about the other thing that because Marvel Comics take place in New York City, Marvel Comics, the company, is in New York City, Marvel Comics has been inserted as this fictional journalism company in the comic, is that you have these authorial metafiction episodes, which are not nearly as weird as they are really weird in some way. Right, but they're not like Animal Man, where Animal Man has to take this weird spiritual journey and break his way outside of the panels so he can go and meet Grant Morrison, his creator. Right? Renee Witterstatter, the editor, and John Byrne stop by to talk all the time, to talk about the stories and how they're going and what the She-Hulk's take on them is. So this is the final issue. I'm not going to read all of it. But Renee comes by and she says, it says John Byrne is dead. She-Hulk says, how did he die? Oh, it was a terrible tragedy. He tripped over a dangling subplot and broke his neck, right? And she says, oh, I've got these other artists that I've got lined up, and I want you to look at their work and see if any of them are any good. And then you get like some of the coolest pages in all of comics, because Byrne basically just went out and asked all of his famous comic artist friends to draw a single page of the She-Hulk. So we get Dave Gibbons, who is the artist on Watchmen, who does this British version of the She-Hulk, right? And this is actually meant to be Margaret Thatcher coming up, but you got these British punk rockers and a British Bobby and all this British slang. And I'm not going to read it all, but it's pretty brilliant. And then you get Walt Simonson, who is very famous for his work on Thor. So we get the She-Hulk as a Asgardian warrior. Again, pretty cool. We get a Frank Miller Sin City page of the She-Hulk. The dialogue on this is actually pretty good. Supporting characters, they start out humble, but first chance they get, they're grabbing whole subplots. Before you know it, they're jockeying for a miniseries of their own. I've seen it happen. It isn't pretty. Okay, so Byrne was a little full of himself. So he never let me wear anything that didn't show me off like an aerobics video. But he made me look gorgeous. He made me feel like a woman, and now he's dead. And now he's dead as Impact Comics, right? So there's a little reference to one of these small startups that died. My thoughts go wild. My lettering goes italic. They say Byrne's death was an accident, but I'm not buying it. Not for a second. No, that's too easy. Too easy and too darn convenient. And it doesn't give me the kind of revenge motive I need. There's someone out there who's going to pay, and pay big. I'll poke him in the eye and tie his shoelaces together, and when he begs for mercy, I'll start with a tickling. Because Byrne is dead as heck, and I'm mad as heck. It's brilliant. Wendy Peener, who did an independent comic called ElfQuest and was part of the first big wave of independent comics, she does She-Hulk, and it's pretty funny because all of her elves have 3 fingers, so she's like checking to see how many fingers she has before she punches. You know she does only have 3 fingers in the top panel. But She-Hulk is a Wendy Peener ElfQuest elf. Howard Chaykin, who's a little more obscure, but he was quite famous in the 80s and 90s for American Flag and some other comics. And notice it's just the same panel, it's just the same image over and over with this message coming in on the answering machine about the She-Hulk. Adam Hughes, who's very famous for his sort of pin-uppery cover art, does a rather risque page with the Wasp naked and the She-Hulk in a bikini, and the attacking Atlantean warriors run away because they've never seen such huge green fists, right? I told you there were issues here, but it's also a lot of fun. I mean, the problem is balancing that. And then finally, you get these pages by Michael Urey and Todd Britton, who end up taking over the comic for the last 10 issues. I don't know why I did so much of those because they're not very interesting. But finally, she says, oh, that final one wasn't half bad. At least I managed to get through it. And she keeps hearing this thump, so she goes to the closet, and John Byrne is tied up and gagged in the closet. He's not dead after all. Renee explains, well, he's been working too hard. He needed a break. And he's all red in the face. Working hard? Of course I've been working hard. Working for you, She-Hulk. Striving to find new and better ways to portray your adventures. Working on a nervous breakdown, you mean? Go ahead, show her the pages you'd turned in for the next issue. Go on, show her. I shall indeed. She-Hulk, I know, will appreciate brilliance when she sees it. And then we get Little She-Hulk. Too many crooks spoil the plot. Hey, Little She-Hulk, Little Wyatt, Little Wheezy, what's wrong? It's Little Zemnu. He's teamed up with Spragg, the living hillock, right? And Spragg is supposed to be the living mountain, right? He's a hillock now. All right, so that's what we get. So what does She-Hulk do? She looks at the pages and she just throws John Byrne out the window from like the 15th floor into the street, and he in fact dies, right? And that's the end of John Byrne's run on the comic, right? I mean, I haven't come up with it yet, but there's got to be definitely a good Roland Barthes death of the author joke to go in here somewhere for those of you who know who he is. But so she basically kills her creator, her writer, the journal. But notice in the story, it's actually not that incoherent because he's just the journalist that happens to be assigned to her, and somebody else will get assigned, right? It's only metatextually, metafictionally, that it becomes very confusing about how he could draw his own death, right? Sort of the same way Moses wrote about his own death in the Bible, right? It's very confusing at the real world level, but actually inside the fiction, it's actually not so confusing. But he's dead, and that's the end of his run on the She-Hulk. But I just want to point out, I haven't tried to give any big theory. I've just tried to point out some cool stuff that I like to think about and how the rules are working with these things. But this particular stuff is all possible, right? The insertion of Byrne, the reading of Marvel Comics in the story as a fictional journalism company, because Marvel Comics occur in New York, but they're also made there, right? So they just turn the actual Marvel Comics into the fictional Marvel Comics in the same place. So that is that. Ooh, I finished just about on time. A little early, actually.